and I am the director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center. And I would love to know if any of you've ever heard of the Smithsonian. Now, if you have, yeah, got to see it. Couple
thumbs up or hands up if you've heard of it.
Yeah. And then, is there anybody who ever has been to the Smithsonian? Ah, okay. All right. So I work at this big place called the Smithsonian Institution. And I don't know if they use the chat function, Ralph, but Mr. Krause, but I would love to just know, when people hear about the Smithsonian, like, what do you think about if you hear that word Smithsonian?
Go ahead and put it in the chat. Oh, museum, art, history. There's a few of them that are coming directly towards me. Science is another one. Someone says it's a zoo.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, the Smithsonian is a massive complex of 19 museums, although our government just told us we have to build 2 more, which is great. One is going to focus on Latino Americans, and one is going to focus on American women's history. But 21 museums and 9 research centers. One is in Panama. We have environmental research centers. We have research centers that focus on conservation. And then, of course, education centers. And so I direct one of those education centers, and it's called the Smithsonian Science Education Center.
So can we just jump right into some of the student questions?
Absolutely.
All right. So one of the kids, they want to know, what was your experience, because you have in your resume that you have experience working with the Department of Education and with the executive office of the president. So what was that like?
So the work that I'm doing with the White House, I'm actually working with them now. And in my work at the US Department of Education, so every country has what's called a Ministry of Education. And that's the group that at the highest federal level, so the highest level within a nation, helps the schools within that nation decide what should they teach, how could they potentially teach it, how do we make certain that they have the financial resources, that schools have the financial resources they need to teach. But my job at the United States Department of Education was, first, I worked in a research center. It was called the Institute of Education Sciences. And I oversaw what was called Cognition and Student Learning Program. And all that basically means is, what have scientists told us, learning scientists told us, are the best methods that we should use to help all of you learn. It's called learning sciences, cognition and learning sciences. And so my work was to work with researchers all over the country and in other countries as well, to better understand how students like you best learn. And then to make certain teachers were using those practices. So that was the first half of my 5 years. And then the second half of my tenure at the US Department of Education was focused more on policy and programming. So I worked with school districts all over the US to help advance education, especially for kids who are in the most under-resourced regions. Now the White House, that work today, that's through what's called the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We work to help advance STEM education for youth across the country.
So you've experienced education from a bunch of different gamuts here, like all across, because you started in the classroom, correct?
That's right. I was a teacher. I taught 4th grade for 5 years, and then I taught 5th grade for almost as long until I had my first child, and I quit only because I wanted to be at home with her, and then I started my work at the Smithsonian.
That's great. I taught 4th and 5th grade for about 4 or 5 years each grade. That's a small world.
I love it. Yeah.
We have a question from Emma. Speaking of other countries, Emma is in Italy, and she had an awesome question for you, Dr. O'Donnell. Emma, you should be able to unmute to ask.
Hello, nice to meet you. I would ask, which is your favorite science?
That's a great question. Astronomy. So ever since I was very, very little, and I grew up in a fairly under-resourced region, and we didn't have a lot of opportunities to travel and to go to Italy, which I would have loved at the time. But I loved to go out in my backyard and just fiddle around with things. And I especially loved to look up at the stars when I could see them, because I couldn't always see them. There was a lot of pollution where I lived. And that's why I became an advocate around environmental science. But I would just say, I would definitely say astronomy, because I love to think about the small piece that we play in this very incredible universe. But I also am very committed to what happens on Earth as a planet and how we protect it.
And that brings me to one of the questions that one of the kids in France emailed me about your writing when it has to do with environmental protections. What are some of the things that you like writing about the most? Like, what inspired you to start writing about that?
So I happened to be in Santiago, Chile in January of 2019, and Zika, which is a mosquito-borne disease, was very prevalent at the time, and everyone across the globe was talking about it. It's kind of like COVID-19 right now. Everyone across the globe is talking about pandemics. Everyone is talking about climate change. Well, at the time, they were talking about mosquito-borne diseases, and we decided, a group of scientists from the Inter-Academy Partnership, we decided we needed to do a better job of educating youth on the most complex socio-scientific issues of our time, whether it's climate change or infectious disease like mosquito-borne diseases or pandemics. And so we committed to using the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd love to see, have all of you have you heard about the SDGs or the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Because that's a framework of ideas that there's a lot of science in it, environmental science.
One of the kids in Spain, they wanted to know how can they become involved on a local level as far as helping their surroundings?
Yeah, it's a great question. So typically in school, your teachers tell you what you should learn. And at the Smithsonian Science Education Center, we are trying to help students discover science from their local community. Use your community as your laboratory and figure out what's going on in your local region. Investigate the science using your local region as your laboratory. And then use what you learn to act, to do something that advances or improves your local region. How many of you would consider yourself, you could use the thumbs up in the Zoom at the bottom, or you can just wave your hand, but how many of you would consider yourself activists? You want to make a difference in your community. Yeah, I think every one of you, especially if you're older, yeah, absolute thumbs up, want to make a difference. And if you're going to go to school and spend all that time learning, why not use the information that you learn to make a difference in the world? And that's the work that the Smithsonian Science Education Center is trying to advance. Give you guys the power to make a difference and engage in improving our world.
One of the kids, they wanted to know what was one of your favorite subjects growing up? I'm guessing I know this, but I figured I'd ask anyway.
Yeah, that's an easy one. It definitely was science. And I think it was because it was the one subject that I felt like when I left school, I could keep learning it. And all that I had to do was to go outside in my backyard. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. So I remember one day, and I tell this story often, but I remember one day I was in class. I was in 8th grade at the time. And that is around age, I think 12, 13. And my teacher was talking about these things called a flatworm. And he told me, oh, and if you cut a flatworm in half, it'll become 2 flatworms. And then he went on and told us something else. But he was just talking, and I thought, wow, I wonder if this is true. So I went home, and there was this creek in my backyard, a little bit of water. And I thought, well, I'm going to look for a flatworm. So I kept turning over all these rocks, and I finally found one. Cut that guy in half, put him in a little makeshift petri dish, and within 2 weeks, I had 2 flatworms. And I will never forget that. That was like this inspirational moment for me, because I thought, wow, I could actually learn science, but more importantly, I could do science. And so that's what inspired me to become absolutely passionate about doing science in order to learn it.
That's wonderful. We have and speaking of which, we have a question from Ivan. Ivan, you should be able to unmute about studying science. And Ivan is in Spain.
Yes, hello. Nice to meet you.
You
I
too.
have out, which is not real about science, but that is related with it. What do you think is the best way to study in a great science university?
So what's the best way to study science at a university?
Yes, that's what he's asking.
You know, I would definitely say, Ivan, because of my passion for doing science, I would say, first of all, try to figure out what is the science you want to learn. Now, it's harder today. Years ago, and even potentially today, people just thought about, oh, I want to study physics, or I want to study computer science. But today it's a little harder because a lot of these sciences are starting to come together. So I would think, first of all, what science do you want to study? And then secondly, which university offers your ability to study that science and to do science? So if all the courses or classes are just you sitting in a large auditorium while you're listening to somebody speak, and you never have an opportunity to go to actually physically study science or do science, the practices of science and engineering, or to go out into your community to study science, then I would say try to avoid that. But look for a program that's going to actually allow you to act and behave like a scientist, engage in the practices of science.
One of the kids from Germany just messaged me and they wanted to know, what advice do you have for students who like science and they want to study science, but they find certain components confusing?
You know, I think that's one of the problems with science. It has an identity crisis, which is that a lot of people view science as too hard, because we often hear the term hard and science used together. So let's try not to do that. The second is that science is something that we should be able to see in our everyday life. We should be able to see that science will help, again, advance our world for social good. So I would suggest there are many different types of scientists. Some are really technical and of course require incredible technical skill, which is important for precision and for experimental design. But other sciences are applications of science. So being able to take what you're learning and then advance social issues. Environmental science is a good example. So figure out where you are along the continuum of technology or mathematical skill, and then find a science versus kind of like social science. And put yourself along that scale and think, I'd rather do something with my scientific knowledge. So maybe I'm interested in environmental science, or I'm really interested in the technical aspects of science. So maybe you want to become a physicist who works in a lab and is not necessarily out in the field. But there's a lot of different types of science.
It's really, really good advice. And we have a really cool question, but we'll go with a few more questions. I know you guys are sending a lot of them in, but we don't want to take our guests too much of our guest time. But Marta, who is, I believe, in Barcelona, you had an awesome question and you should be able to unmute. We'll see. Marta, there she goes.
Hi, hello. I was saying, Ralph, that today in Spain is the International Day of Worker Woman. So I want to know that if you being a woman think that just being a woman gives you problems or something in this industry, or do you think that you have to work harder just for your gender? Thank you.
Marta, that is an amazing question, and what an important question to ask on a day like International Women's Day. So thank you for pointing that out. It's not been easy, Marta. I have spent most of my career specifically focused on physics and astronomy, and that field is predominantly men. There have been times when I've been sitting in a room, and this happens often, where I'm the only woman who's in the room. I'm going to tell you a very quick story to kind of show you sometimes it's very difficult. I was meeting with an international delegation. I won't say from which country. We were in the Smithsonian, and this was a very important day. And we were there to all talk about the scientific work we do. I was the only person in the room who was a female, and I was the only person in the room who focuses on science education. Everyone was seated at the table. This is not illiteracy, this is actually physically seated at the table, and I was put on the perimeter. And I had to stand up and go to the organizer and say, it's important, I'm here as well, I'm going to be giving a talk as well, that I'm at the table. And I know sometimes you'll hear that expression, oh, we're not always at the table. That's an expression that people use to say people are not being inclusive, but it was true that day. And I had to find the bravery to be able to say, please put me at the table as well. And that's not always easy. I was also asked by the organizers to go last, just in case they didn't get to me and they didn't have time. So these things do happen. Now, I don't know that they're intentional, but please know, you always have to speak up. And sometimes it is very hard for women because we don't represent a high percentage of many of the technical fields in science.
And that's wonderful advice, especially on the day of women's work in Spain. So thank you for that question, and thank you for that awesome answer. One of our younger kids, they wanted to know, what is your favorite thing about working at the Smithsonian?
The Smithsonian is an amazing place to work. I was there for 11 years, from 1991 to 2003, January 2003, and then I came back. And now I've been there for 6 years in addition. So 17 years at one of the most amazing places to work. The thing that I love the most about it is that I told you earlier, like, I love doing science. So things or objects make a huge difference in my ability to learn and my passion and excitement for something. And there are 5.6 million objects at the Smithsonian. And so that's one of the reasons I love it. In addition, science is not in isolation. Science is put in context with technology, engineering, math, the arts, history, culture. And that's what I love about it. It's a place where no matter what you're interested in, there's something there for you to learn. In addition, it feels like there are always things to do at the Smithsonian. This weekend, we celebrated International Women's Day. This is a month to celebrate women, and we had an event where we did science activities with girls from all over the US and those from across the globe who were visiting. So it's a fun place to work.
I put that out in the chat, guys. Definitely check out the link. It's si.edu. I have a question. I know we have a lot of student questions, but do you have a favorite object at the museum? And it doesn't have to be science.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit there, but the Apollo lunar landing module is one of our biggest objects, but it's also one of my favorite. And what I really love about it, for those of you who are kind of like techie, is that the Smithsonian did a 3-dimensional scan of it. So if you actually went on our website, I think it's like www.si.edu/3D, you can actually go inside of the Apollo lunar landing module as if you're inside of it. Gabriel, you've got a background that kind of reminds me of what it's like, where you actually feel like you're inside of this lunar landing module. So that's my favorite project.
I think that's just out of this world. So I just had to drop that pun. So we have a couple more questions, then we'll let you go. Sophia, and she had another question regarding being a female in the sciences, and she is in Madrid, I believe. Sophia, you should be able to ask.
Hello, I'm Sophia. I'm from Spain. Yes, I'm from Cartagena. I just wanted to know, because I was part of the project Inspiring Girls, and like this one, there's also other projects like Technovation, maybe you know these, that try to introduce women into these part of like sciences and all these things. Do you recommend any courses, not only for women, but like for young people to get introduced into sciences for university and also to learn themselves? I'm mostly interested in like health sciences, and I want to be a doctor, but any science projects that you would recommend to everyone?
There are certainly a lot of things that are going on. I'll tell you about one. Again, I'm just going to say locally, George Mason University and the Smithsonian came together to advance conservation science. And that's one of the most important areas as we think about biodiversity and biodiversity loss that we all suffer from across the globe. And so the Smithsonian partnered up with the George Mason University to create an undergraduate program, well, also a master's degree program that focuses on advancing students' knowledge of biodiversity and conservation. And what I love about those courses are that they are, some of the courses are available virtually so that people can take them from across the globe. But many of them are physically engaging in conservation with animals that are on the endangered list at our Conservation Biology Institute. So a place where you can actually see animals that we're trying to bring back into the wildlife. I think that there are certainly a lot of other courses that are available virtually. You know, but I think a good local example is from this Conservation Biology Institute. And Sophia, there's so many things, of course, so many opportunities for women to advance their knowledge in STEM. I think there's a much greater emphasis on advancing women in STEM than we've ever seen before. And our center, the Smithsonian Science Education Center, is working on a project called Women in STEM 2D, and it's science, technology, engineering, math, manufacturing, and design. So there's also this making of things that's a part of science or STEM.
That's great advice. And last year for Women in STEM, we had some female astronauts, and guys, definitely check back on the website because we'll try and get some of those back again. One of our kids wanted to know what advice would you have for them if they want to go into a science, but necessarily like they kind of have to pivot career-wise?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do from a very young age is to provide opportunities for young students as young as 5 to 15, to engage in the practices of science, technology, engineering, and math from a very young age. Because the reality is that those fundamental years do matter when you're trying to enter into a STEM field. One, because of it's a way to develop your interest, but two, you're also developing those fundamental skills. As we know, mathematics is a magnet, right, for science. You have to have some basic understanding of mathematics and scientific practices in order to enter often many of the science fields. But if you have entered into undergraduate work and you don't have a background and you feel like science is a weakness, please don't use that to keep you from pursuing a STEM degree or a science degree. A very quick story. I teach astronomy for the physics department at George Washington University. So this is a different university. And I have had young students who are undergraduates, and they are around 17, 18 years old. And after their freshman year, they've come up to me after taking my course and said to me, I have hated, and I hate this expression, but I have hated science my whole life. And now I feel completely different about it. But I don't think I have the right background to pursue a science degree. So I'm thinking I shouldn't. And my answer to them is always, absolutely no. There is never a time that is too late to pursue a science degree. You might have to take extra courses that build your scientific or your mathematical knowledge, for example, if you're entering a field that requires mathematical knowledge, but it is never too late. So I hope that you always will consider pursuing it.
So we had one more question from the students, and then I'll follow up with a final question. This is Sarah. I'm not sure what country she's in, but I'll let her ask. It has to do with female employment with the sciences. So Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm from Spain, and as Marta said before, today is the International Women's Day, and I just wanted to ask you, as I'm doing a project about an important woman, I wanted to do it about you, and I just wanted to ask, what would you say to a woman that isn't accepted in a scientific job because she's a woman?
You know, there have been, Sarah, there's been a lot of research, and I participated with the Pew Research Center in one of those studies as an external advisor to study whether or not women who enter STEM careers, so science, technology, engineering, and math careers, actually are able to persist in those careers. And unfortunately, in many cases, even if a woman engages in taking science coursework in undergraduate, they get an undergraduate degree in science, they'll go off to the field and they'll get a job in science, but then they run up against barriers that keep them from persisting or pursuing that job. Many women face adversity, according to this Pew Research study, where people in the field that they're working in, they don't treat them fairly, so they're not being equitable. They don't include them in decision-making. They don't give women opportunities to advance. And as a result, women end up leaving the field. And I think many organizations, including the Smithsonian, are trying to change that. You know, we want women to persist. Don't let somebody else influence you as to whether or not you want to pursue your dreams. Always be brave, like I was in that room, and that wasn't easy, to be able to push so that you are at the table, that nobody's keeping you. And this includes men and women, both, that nobody keeps you from being able to be physically at the table and even literally at the table when it comes to advanced opportunities, either getting a job or keeping that job.
It's phenomenal advice. And I love that quote. Don't let anyone keep you from being at that table. That's so great. All right, I'll have the last question. So as someone as accomplished as you are in your field, you've won awards, you've been published, you have had every imaginable job in education. What advice would you have for these kids as they kind of go off into the world and figure out what they want to be and who they want to be?
You know, I would definitely say, first of all, don't ever give up. I would have never imagined when I was a young high school student who was trying to figure out whether I wanted to go to college, because I had 7 people in my family and nobody had gone to college, not my parents, not my siblings. But I loved learning and I wanted to be a teacher. So I found a local university to go to. I didn't know that you could apply to more than one university. That was a foreign idea to me. So I went to a local university. I learned to be a teacher, a science teacher, and I found a science teaching job. I never thought today I would be at the Smithsonian working globally with students like you all over the world to advance science education. It doesn't happen overnight. I've been working on this for 37 years, and I've taken small steps in order to achieve big goals. So when you set your goals, first of all, set a big one. Go big, go for the gold, you know, big thing, big ideas, but decide the small steps that you need to take along the way. And I learned this from someone else, but he once said, tell that idea to others so that you commit to it. Write it down so you don't lose track of it, and then figure out what are those small steps you'll take along the way. And don't be afraid if you fail, because I have failed 1,000 times more than I've succeeded. And sometimes it's really hard. But every time you fail, you think, oh man, I am never going to forget this. And now you've learned something. And that's the way that failure works to help us advance. So for every one of you, set up your goals, write them down, tell them to somebody else, and figure out those small steps along the way. So that's the biggest piece of advice I would give.